Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel After Dark Coffee and Crime. If you are new to the channel, hi and welcome, and if you've watched me before, I'm really happy to see you back here and engaging with you in the live chat. So just as a sort of a heads up, I am not at home recording this. I am actually away on holiday, but to keep with the consistency and to keep making sure that I've got content each week, I'm recording this while I am away. So you might hear a little bit of wind because it's windy here in the Maldives, or you might hear the waves or a little bit of rain if it rains. It's eased off a bit now, so I've kind of just jumped in to get a good recording as good as I can. So here we go. So in today's case, I'm going to be looking at the Chicago Strangler, which I didn't know until I had a little dive through my unsolved crimes of serial killers, that this was a case that had happened and was unsolved. The Chicago Strangler, is a serial killer responsible for lots of murders, and they range from the ages of 18 to 58, and there's been at least 50 women, and the killer remains free. They haven't caught him. So here we go with some of the story. I haven't got information on all of the victims, but what I have got is some of the victims, which I will talk about, and you'll notice a pattern in how the killer selects his women. So, as with all my videos, I like to just give you a trigger warning ahead of time, because this case talks about the murder of women, sex work, drugs, causes of death, and what may have happened to the women, including the discussions around rape. So as I say each week, if that's something that you're not able to deal with, if it's triggering to you, then I totally understand that. And obviously you must look after yourselves and put yourselves first. So please, you can leave this podcast, but you'll find another one hopefully and rejoin us on the next one. And as with all of my podcasts that I do, the information that I am sharing is through the information that I've sourced, either through the internet, news articles, books, videos, and they are for informational and educational purposes only, and are not designed to upset anyone who may know the victims or who have been in a similar situation, the families, that kind of thing. It is as drawn in as much as the facts as I can, and as always remaining respectful to the victims that were involved, and of course their family. And there is a website called the Unforgotten 51, and I did source a lot of my information from there, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So today we are in the state of Chicago and Illinois, and Chicago is no stranger to violent crimes, and the records that I've looked at said that from 2001 at least 75 women have been brutally murdered across various locations of Chicago. So as I mentioned, there is the website called Unforgotten 51, and you can have a look in that. It's quite in depth. I found some details there on the victims and the names of all 51 that they have, that we will mention at the end because we don't want them to be forgotten, and it's respectful, I think, to just list the names off so that we can say them, like anyone else who has looked at this case, researched this case. It's a thing that we say their name because they are the Unforgotten 51. The Unforgotten 51 is run by journalism students from Roosevelt University, and they actually decided to take some investigative work on this because they wanted to look at the unsolved murders, because a lot of them included strangulation, and it helps to keep the victims very much public, and it brings attention to it because they don't want them to be forgotten. They had been in contact with the families, and they'd got some more background history of the victims, which they have undertaken as part of their journalism studies. So the cases of these women that have gone missing, that have been murdered, date back to 2001, and the pattern reportedly started again in the year 2017, and it continued through into 2018. And the pattern of their murders were strangulation, and they were often dumped by like garbage areas, if there's bins, or in alleyways, vacant lots, buildings that have been left kind of abandoned, and some of the bodies were set on fire. And that was a ongoing thing with the women that went missing. And another common thing with these ladies was that they were predominantly black women, and that they were predominantly either prostitutes or they were using drugs of some kind, and there was often rape involved when they did the autopsies on the women as well. But because the murders perceived a lack of input from the police, and a lot of the families have said that they think it's because of their loved ones' backgrounds or the fact that they were in drugs. So the police didn't put in the amount of effort into solving the crimes and finding the person that did it to their loved one, their sister, their daughter, and for some it could be their mother. So a non-profit organisation called the Murder Accountability Project, MAP, was actually the first that sounded like an alarm on the women. And the MAP project uses an algorithm, and it helps to determine patterns of killers and whether or not there is a serial killer that they are actually looking at. So in relation to the Chicago Strangler, the non-profit organisation shared that there was a pattern, and that they said that there is a possible serial killer. They believed that the marks of what was happening to the women were that of a serial killer. The organisation also pointed out that, as I said, most of the women that were killed were sex workers and had battled drug addiction. And so the families did argue that they felt their loved ones' cases were not being investigated in the same depth that other cases may have been investigated, but the police said that they were doing their best. And recently, even in 2019, they did a task force, they created one, and this was to review the cases of the 51 women, and law enforcement also added that they couldn't find any connection through DNA, and they kind of thought that there was a lack of interest, mainly because of these women who were being murdered were black with a history of using drugs and sex workers. And it has been compared to cases like that of Lacey Peterson. She was a white lady who was pregnant. She was a married woman. Husband was working. She went missing, and they thoroughly investigated her situation. They looked for her. They were very detailed and methodical, and they spent a lot of time. So when they compared to what they were seeing with Lacey Peterson's investigation, they felt that their loved ones were not afforded the same kind of input. And we know that all of the women's bodies that were found, they were also, as I said, disposed of in very similar fashions within and around the city of Chicago. Some victims, as I said, they had been raped. Some had been beaten, others were bound and gagged, and some of the women had plastic bags tied over their heads and most of these women were stripped of their clothing, and as I said before, some of the women were set on fire. So some of the women would have been set on fire, some of them weren't. So there was a little bit of difference in how some of the women were found, but primarily they would have suffered the strangulation, and how that they were, they were just sort of left abandoned in areas like abandoned buildings and in trash bins and things like that. So not all of the women would have undergone the same thing when they were murdered and when they were disposed of, but there was a pattern in how he did it, even if two were not the same. Overall, the pattern was he would strangle them, he would possibly beat them, rape them, one or the other. He would either burn them or he would dispose of them. So there was a pattern. Similarly, the victim profiles were very similar. As I said, they were predominantly black, and they were more often than not sex workers. But there have been the odd women that have had professions, and they are of a different race. One of the women that was murdered was white, so that was different to his normal selection of victims. But again, as I mentioned, nearly all of those victims were at least strangled and stripped, and then abandoned. A large number of the strangulations were committed in just sort of 3 police districts located in the south and the west side of the Chicago area, with already histories of violent crimes and drug use, such as Washington Park and Garfield Park, and they were common locations for the murders to occur. Between 1999 and the year 2018, 17 women between the ages of 18 and 58 were strangled to death in Chicago. Whether all of those can be attributed to the Chicago Strangler, I don't know, because there is another chap who also murdered women in a similar fashion, but he wasn't found to be the murderer, and I'll discuss him as we go through. But by the end of the year of 2019, police had only solved 24 cases, and the remaining unforgotten 51, they were not solved. And so, as with all deaths, these represent a unique tragedy, because at the end of the day, they were people. They had mothers, they had fathers, they were daughters, some had children, some were pregnant, some were sisters, and so each one of those people, doesn't matter what they did, they didn't deserve to die. They were someone's family. And the one thing that has come out when the families have been spoken to was that despite some of the backgrounds of these women, there was love for their family member. So I'm just going to go through some of the victims that have been noted, that I have been able to find a little bit of information on. Obviously I haven't been able to find them all, but it'll just give you some information on some of those victims, but obviously I'll name the 51 at the end. So Angela Ford, she was the earliest unsolved case, and sadly she vanished after leaving her home to pick up her children's report cards back in 1999. She was sadly found strangled and unconscious days after the disappearance, and she eventually died in 2001 after a year and a half of being in a coma. And the killer didn't have boundaries at all. He murdered women from as young as 18 up to the ages of 58. And one of the victims was a grandmother, another one was a great-grandmother, and one of his victims was indeed pregnant. In 2007, 2 women were found murdered within 48 hours of each other, not 24. Teresa Bunn, and she was 8 months pregnant, was strangled, she was stripped, she was thrown in a dumpster, and she was set on fire. And then the next day, another victim called Hazel Lewis was found, and her body was found burning in a trash can and behind an elementary school. Teresa was aged 21, and she was an expectant mum, and she was excited about giving birth, and she'd already given a name to her son. She knew she was having a boy, and she was going to name him Michael Pierre Terry Bunn, and that was a name that was a homage to her 14-year-old brother. On November the 12th, 2007, her body was found in the dumpster near Washington Park in Chicago, and she was naked. Her body was badly burned, and she had been strangled. And she actually could only be identified through dental records, which took the authorities 3 days to identify her. On the morning that Teresa's body was found, she had told relatives that she was actually going shopping, but she never actually returned home. Just over 24 hours later, the body of Hazel Lewis was then found near the same park, Washington Park, over on the south side of Chicago, and Hazel was also burned and left in the trash bin, and again her body was also unrecognisable. And Hazel was a mum to 3, so she left behind 3 daughters, and she was a great grandmother. And no matter, as I said, what the details of these women's pasts are, they were human, all of them, and they didn't deserve to die, and they certainly didn't deserve to be, just thrown in amongst trash and burn and to be unrecognisable to their family members. Hazel Lewis was 52, and like many, she was found strangled to death, and she was also left burning in a trash bin behind an elementary school. Hazel's family is among those that the researchers tried to find, but they were unsuccessful in trying to reach her family to talk to them. But what they did say was that she was someone's mum, she was someone's fiance, she was a cousin, grandmother, sister, and she did not deserve to die in this way. One of the other victims was a lady called Gwendolyn Williams, and she was the eldest of 6 children, and she was born in 1957. And what I read about Gwendolyn was that she actually loved to dance, and sadly she was found murdered in 2002. She was found strangled, lifeless, and covered in blood. Her body had been discarded behind a dollar store, and her body was half dressed, and they found that she had drugs and alcohol in her system. Investigators also found semen and a stranger's skin beneath her nails, evidence that Gwen had actually put up a fight to save herself, and sadly she was 44 when she was murdered. Rio was the first girl to be born into the family, and this meant that she was doted upon, showered with lots of love, and in fact her aunt even marked her arrival for Rio and had a tattoo put on her arm. Rio grew up in the south side of the Englewood neighbourhood. I hope I pronounced that right. As she grew older, she would ride the train with her cousins and explore the city, and she also liked to sing. Back in 1993, when Sister Act 2 came out, Rio would pause the VCR and she would sing all of the songs serenading her cousins. Rio's body was discovered on September 10th, 2018. The Chicago Sun-Times reported that at 11:27 on September the 10th, a sanitation worker was dumping garbage into the garbage truck when he saw the woman's body among the rubbish. She was then transported to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. It was evident that she had been murdered, discarded in her trash, and because of the way that she had been murdered, her family never got to hold a funeral or give her a proper farewell, because her body, by the time she had actually been found, she had decomposed so badly, so she had to be cremated. Another lady called Margaret Gomez, she'd got a lot of promise. She was in the cheer squad. She loved art, but she did have a low self-esteem. Her mother was strict while she was growing up, and that kind of led her to be a rebel. On January the 12th in 2006, Margaret Gomez was found dead. She was partially clothed in a salvage yard under a tractor in the city's southwest side. Again, she was found, like many of the others, partially dressed, and she actually had a rope around her neck, and she had actually been stabbed in the neck, and she had also been shot in the head. And her family say that the police who were investigating began sort of waning off after a month, and they questioned whether they were not as interested because she had an addiction to drugs. And then, as with some serial killers, there is usually a break in time before they kill again, and there was around a period of around 6 years where there had been no sort of further murders, and then the killer struck again in 2013, and he attacked a lady called Amy Martinez, and she, like all the other ladies, she was strangled, stuffed in a dumpster. She was also set on fire. Amy was Hispanic, so she wasn't black like the others, and that was the only difference in her situation. Our next victim was a lady called Nancy Walker, and she was born on August the 15th in 1947 in Birmingham, Alabama. And she was someone who also liked to dance a lot, and she had dreams of becoming an entrepreneur, and Nancy didn't want to work for other people. She wanted to be her own boss, and so she held a lot of promise. She went to grammar school, and she was the captain in the cheerleading squad. She migrated with her family to Chicago in 1961, and that's where she grew up. Her and her sisters loved to eat chocolate chip cookies and black walnut ice cream. So you can tell that the family were close and that they clearly loved Nancy. In high school, Nancy was very successful in what she was doing. She also enjoyed modern dance, which was her actual favourite kind of dance. She went on to study jazz and ballet. Nancy went on to graduate from the Francis Parker and attended Columbia College, and she majored in accounting, and she wanted to choose a career that would provide greater longevity and more income than dance. So even though she really loved dance, she wanted to pursue something so that she could give her family the best life that they could possibly have. She pursued several different careers, But in the end, she did stay true to dancing. She stayed true to wanting to be an entrepreneur, and she actually opened her own studio in Englewood. And here, she was at her happiest. She taught yoga and jazzercise. And she also had a passion for dance with the Buddhist community. None of those who knew Nancy were surprised by her success. They expected it. She had a goal. She wanted to achieve it. And she also became a landlord of 5 residential buildings that she had purchased. And she'd also purchased a beauty salon and a trucking company. So you can see the determination within Nancy. She wanted the best. She wanted to be an entrepreneur, and she succeeded. So her sister Myrna knew something was wrong when Nancy didn't show up for lunch. She was expecting her to show for lunch. She waited. She called her and she didn't answer. And then she tried calling her again all evening with no answer. The sisters would usually talk every morning. So it was a bit unusual. And then the next day, her sister tried calling her again all day, was still no answer. And she said this was not like Nancy at all. And the last time that they had spoken together, she said that she was on her way downtown to meet her for lunch. But 2 days had passed, there was still no word, and it was on the Thursday, and Myrna sensed something was wrong, but wasn't completely alarmed. She figured that Nancy, she would reach her at some point, and she had all of her dance classes and stuff, so she knew what her routine was, and she knew that she never missed on those. But then she found out that she had not shown up to these classes. So again, then Myrna was extremely worried, because she was like she would never not turn up to her classes. And this left Myrna feeling anxious. And she then decided to take herself to her sister's house for a welfare check. And when she walked into her house, she knew that she hadn't been back to the house in those few days. So again, they contacted the police, and the family say, very much similar to the other victims' families, that they weren't moved into action. They feel that it was somebody who would just walk away from things and her life, but it didn't make sense to her family. And Nancy, they knew Nancy was a businesswoman, and on the day she had made a run to the bank was the day she disappeared. And they said, why would she just up and leave? She wouldn't. The family knew her, and they knew her very well, and they knew that this was not normal behaviour for Nancy. And so her family wanted answers, and they pushed for answers, and they pushed for the police to take action, but they said that they didn't seem bothered. But they did continue to press the police. They didn't give up, and at some point they were able to get an article in the press to get Nancy's story out there, so that people, would know about her and potentially see the article and might have some information. But sadly, 7 weeks after her disappearance in 2003, March the 19th, the bad news came in. And the news was that they had found her, or what was left of her, because she had indeed been dismembered. Her body parts were placed in trash bags, and they had been left on the Bishop Ford Highway. Nancy was just 55. Jessica Flores was a 36-year-old mum to 6 children, and she did have mental health issues. and she lived in south suburban area of South Chicago Heights. In February 2019, her family reported her missing. That month, police reportedly found a car that they knew that Jessica had been driving, and it had been set on fire. The car's back seat was covered in blood and reportedly contained some of Jessica's belongings. Jessica's family did cling to hope, and that they thought that the search parties, and the police would find her, but a year passed with no luck. However, in this case, there were charges made against a 42-year-old man in connection with the disappearance, but her body hadn't been found, so the police later dropped those charges. In April of 2020, 14 months after Jessica disappeared, a city worker made the same discovery as a lot of the others had previously made with the other victims, and this worker came across a skull and a human spine. The Lake County Coroner's Office identified the remains using dental records, and it was evidenced to be Jessica Flores. And they worked with the Indiana State Police and the Lake County Homicide Unit. In some ways, again, the discovery raised more questions for the family than it answered. And again, this situation, the police were not motivated like they would have been in other cases, because sadly, Jessica had become addicted to prescription morphine because she had been cooking with frying oil and there was a fire, so she tried to put the fire out and this spilled onto her and covered her body, so she suffered severe burns, and as a result of that she had a lengthy recovery in hospital and she became addicted to the medication, which then led her to explore other medications, and that's why they believe that the police were not as interested because of her addiction. But despite the fact that Jessica had these addictions, that led her to be out on the streets more and more and taking different drugs, she also always managed to make her way home. However, obviously the day that she went missing, she never returned. Another victim was a lady who was 26-year-old Shantia Smith. I hope I said that right. And she was a mum to a 6-year-old. She was found murdered in the year of 2018. And similar to other bodies, she was found badly decomposed beneath a car in an abandoned garage on the west side of Chicago. And again, for her, she was identified by dental records, which was the only way we could prove her identity. And although her body was undiscovered for over a week, there was extreme tissue loss and there was evidence of maggots, and they were reported on the examination. The only substances that they found in her system were traces of nicotine and alcohol, and they said that her cause of death was likely to be blunt force trauma to the head and the neck. So it's slightly different to some of the others, but her body had been left to decompose, and that was the coroner's final conclusion. And although Shantia's case remains unsolved, the family believe that she was murdered and that they believe they know who did it. They have text messages and they wanted to prove it, but they still wait for justice. They wanted the police to take the lead seriously. And that maybe if they had taken the information seriously when they report her missing, maybe they believe she could still have been alive today. So, as you can see, with a lot of the women that were murdered in Chicago, they were strangled. Their profiles were similar, but no one was caught for those crimes. And so for many of them, the case remains unsolved. Most of the women, as I said previously, they were predominantly black. However, there were some white women that had been murdered, and there was a Hispanic lady that had been murdered, so slightly different. However, they did have the backgrounds of drugs and prostitution. Between 1962 and 2017, Andre Crawford was an American serial killer. He was a rapist, and he used to have sex with the bodies of deceased victims. Now, he was known to have killed 11 women between the year of 1993 and 1999 in Chicago. His victims were also addicted to drugs, and they worked as sex workers. And as I said, he would have sex with their corpses also. And he was found guilty on all counts of those murders, and he was actually sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. However, despite all of his crimes being similar to that of the Chicago Strangler, he wasn't found to be guilty of the murders and the rapes and of the disposal of those victims that I've just spoken about. And for the other victims who will also be listed at the end, he was not found connected to those murders. So it left the serial killer still out in Chicago. And to this day, they have not found the person who is guilty of murdering, raping, strangling, and disposing of these ladies' bodies. And so obviously, when they looked at the information and the DNA to that of Andre Crawford, he couldn't be tied or connected. There was no evidence that he had been near those women. We know that the dates of these murders, span over quite a period of time, and actually the most recent murder being in 2018. And because we don't actually know the age of the person committing the crimes, they could be a younger person or they could be an older person. So it would be difficult to know if that person was still alive, depending on the age that he started to commit those crimes. Obviously, if he is younger, then he is still going to be out and about. And that's a concern, because it could be, as we know, there was a break of 6 years, that he could be on a break and he could strike again. Equally, if he was older and he is deceased, he may never be found, and justice for the victims may never be found. And obviously he's been, out there committing the crimes up until as recent as I said, as 2018, and he still hasn't been caught. Sadly, as we know, a lot of these women didn't have the best backgrounds. However, they were someone's family members, and they did not deserve to be murdered in the way that they were, and the families deserved to have their families' murders investigated. And the common theme was that they were not offered this didn't happen, and it was because they believed that the victims were prostitutes and took drugs, that they weren't as important. But everybody is important. Every life matters. And as I said, in terms of serial killers and information, there isn't actually a lot of information on the Chicago Strangler. It's quite limited, to be honest. I found some information in some reading materials that I got, and obviously a lot from the Unforgotten 51, but I was able to gather enough information that I thought it was important to cover this, because the case is unsolved and because there is a potential serial killer still roaming the streets of Chicago, and not many people may know about this. I didn't know about this, and I'm quite familiar with all the different kinds of serial killers and things, and it just happened to be in one of my books that I had that I came across it, and I wanted to cover something different, and I felt this was a good one to bring attention to, especially because it is unsolved and that there is potentially someone out there who has committed those crimes, who could commit those crimes again. As I do with all my podcasts, at the end I do like to either have a photograph of the victim and play some music, just so that you can take a moment to remember them. But obviously I can't do that with all of these victims that I've got here, and some of them I can't because there's no information on them other than their names. So I am going to read each individual name of the Unforgotten 51 and close out with music as I do so. So to begin with, Teresa Bunn, Margaret Gomez, Diamond Turner, Hazel Lewis, Shantia Smith, Rio Renee Holyfield, Angela Mariana Ford, Charlotte Day, Winifred Shines, Brenda Cowart, Elaine Bonita, Saudia Banks, Bessie Scott, Gwendolyn Williams, Lorraine Harris, Deli Jones, Celeste Jackson, Nancy Walker, Tarika Jones, Linda Green, Rosenda Barasio, Latonya Keeler, Jodie Grissom, Latricia Hall, Lucy Sett Thomas, Ethel Amerson, Michelle Davenport, Tamala Edwards, Makalalva Williams, Precious Smith, Denise Torres, Wanda Hall, Yvette Mason, Shaniqua Williams, Antoinette Simons, Kelly Sarf, Veronica Fraser, Marianne Saskowski, Genevieve Melas, Charlene Miller, Latoya Banks, Shannon Williams, Vanessa Rajokovic, LaFonda Wilson, Jessica Flores, Kunda Kreider, Angela Profit, Pamela Wilson, Velma Howard, Katrina